Officer Jerry strode down the familiar streets of Maple Grove, his eyes scanning every corner with the sharpness of a hawk. To him, the world was divided into two types of people, those who followed the rules and those who didn't. His badge felt heavy on his chest, not just as a symbol of authority, but as a weight of responsibility he carried with pride. To Jerry, the law was black and white. There was no room for gray, no space for second chances. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, Jerry had learned early on that life wasn't easy. His family had relied on community charities during hard times, but Jerry had buried those memories deep. He believed that the only way to survive was through discipline and unwavering adherence to the rules. It was why he became a cop in the first place, to protect, to enforce, and to maintain order. As he turned the corner onto Oak Street, Jerry's gaze locked onto a group of teenagers gathered outside a small convenience store. His instincts kicked in. He quickened his pace, his hand resting on his belt, ready for any sign of trouble. "All right, break it up," Jerry barked, his voice stern and authoritative. The teens jumped at the sound of his voice, their relaxed demeanor instantly replaced with nervousness. "We're not doing anything, officer," one of the boys stammered, trying to smile. Jerry wasn't convinced. His eyes scanned the group, his mind already drawing conclusions. Groups of kids meant trouble. Always had, always would. "I don't want to see any loitering. Move along," he commanded, waving them off. As the teens hurried away, casting uneasy glances over their shoulders, Jerry felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. He had prevented potential trouble, just as he always did. In his mind, assuming the worst kept the peace. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, 9-year-old Natalie stood hand in hand with her mother, Caroline, as they navigated the crowded aisles of the bustling grocery store. Natalie's big brown eyes sparkled with curiosity as she gazed at the colorful displays of fruits and vegetables. Her dark hair was neatly tied back in a ponytail, and she wore her favorite blue sundress, with a small chocolate stain from the candy bar she had enjoyed earlier. "Mommy, can we get strawberries?" Natalie asked in her soft, sweet voice. Caroline smiled down at her daughter, squeezing her hand gently. "Of course, sweetie. They're on the list." As they moved through the store, Caroline noticed how packed it was. The checkout line stretched far, and people bumped into each other in the narrow aisles. She glanced at her watch, realizing there was still much shopping to be done. She knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes. "Nat, honey, it's really crowded in here. Would you mind waiting for me outside by the entrance? I'll be quicker if I finish up on my own." Natalie's eyes widened with understanding. "Okay, Mommy, I'll be good and stay right by the door," she said, nodding seriously. Caroline touched her daughter's cheek affectionately. "That's my girl," she whispered, reaching into her purse to hand Natalie a small pack of crackers. "You can have these while you wait. I won't be long, I promise." Natalie took the crackers with a bright smile. "Thank you, Mommy." Caroline watched as Natalie skipped towards the store's entrance, her little sundress swishing around her knees. A mother's instinct caused a slight twinge of worry, but she knew her daughter was responsible. It was a safe neighborhood, and she'd only be a few minutes. Natalie found a small bench just outside the store, swinging her legs as she munched on her crackers. She watched the people come and go, smiling shyly at anyone who caught her eye. The sun warmed her face, and she felt content as she waited for her mother to return. Unbeknownst to her, Officer Jerry's patrol car was rolling down the street. Jerry's sharp eyes scanned the area, as they always did. His attention was immediately drawn to the little girl sitting alone outside the store, his brow furrowed, a young girl, unsupervised, eating a snack. His suspicion flared. Jerry pulled his patrol car to a stop across the street, watching Natalie intently. He noticed the way she looked around, how she nervously fiddled with the snack in her hand. In Jerry's mind, it all added up to one thing: trouble. "Probably shoplifting," he muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. "Or maybe loitering, at the very least." Without a second thought, Jerry stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting on his belt as he strode purposefully across the street. His face was stern, unyielding, as he approached the young girl. Natalie looked up as the officer's shadow fell over her. Her wide eyes were filled with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. She had been taught that police officers were there to help, but something about Jerry's expression made her feel uneasy. "Excuse me, young lady," Jerry said, his voice gruff and authoritative. "What are you doing here all alone?" Natalie swallowed hard, her voice coming out in a timid whisper. "I'm waiting for my mommy, sir. She's inside shopping." Jerry's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the crackers in her hand. "And where did you get that?" he demanded, pointing at the snack. Natalie's lower lip trembled slightly. "My mommy gave them to me, sir, to eat while I wait," she stammered. Jerry wasn't convinced. He crossed his arms, looming over the small girl. "Are you sure about that? You didn't take it from the store without paying?" Tears welled up in Natalie's eyes as she shook her head vigorously. "No, sir. I promise my mommy gave them to me." Jerry's suspicion only grew with each passing moment. In his mind, this girl was up to no good. Without a second thought, he reached out and grasped Natalie's arm firmly. "That's enough. You're coming with me," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. Natalie burst into tears, her small body shaking with fear. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong. My mommy, she's inside. Please," she cried, her words barely coherent between her sobs. But Jerry wasn't listening. He was too convinced of his own assumptions, too focused on what he believed to be right. Jerry led Natalie towards his patrol car, his grip firm on her small arm. Natalie's tears flowed freely now, her soft sobs echoing in the quiet afternoon air. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong," she whimpered, her voice trembling. Her tiny hands tried to tug free from Jerry's grasp, but the officer's mind was made up. He had seen too many situations go wrong by giving people the benefit of the doubt, and he wasn't about to let that happen today. As they approached the patrol car, a small crowd began to form. People stopped in their tracks, watching the scene unfold with a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on?" someone whispered from the back of the growing group. "Is that little girl in trouble?" Jerry's face remained hard as stone. To him, the girl's tears were just a distraction, a tactic to avoid consequences. "Get in the car," he said sternly, opening the back door of his cruiser. Natalie looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, I'm just waiting for my mommy," she hiccuped, her voice barely audible. But Jerry didn't respond. He hoisted her up, her small feet dangling above the ground as he placed her inside the back of the car. The sound of her sobs filled the air, mixing with the murmurs of the onlookers. Phones were pulled out, cameras aimed at the unfolding drama. "This doesn't look right," someone muttered. "Why is he arresting a little girl?" Just then, Caroline emerged from the grocery store, her arms laden with bags of groceries. She scanned the area for Natalie, expecting to see her sitting on the bench where she'd left her. But instead, her heart stopped. There, just a few feet away, stood her daughter, locked inside the back of a police car, her face streaked with tears. Caroline's stomach dropped, and her bags fell to the ground with a thud. "Natalie!" Caroline cried out, rushing toward the patrol car, panic rising in her chest. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice shaking as she turned to face Jerry. "Why is my daughter in handcuffs?" Jerry turned to Caroline, his expression still unreadable. "Ma'am, I caught this young lady stealing from the store," he stated matter-of-factly, as if it was the simplest explanation in the world. Caroline's eyes widened in disbelief. "Stealing? That's impossible," she exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch. "She was waiting for me while I finished shopping. Natalie would never steal." Her voice cracked with both fear and fury as she looked back at her daughter, who sat trembling inside the car. Natalie's tear-filled eyes met her mother's. "Mommy, I told him I didn't do anything wrong," she sobbed. "I was just waiting for you." But he wouldn't listen. Caroline's rage flared. She turned to Jerry, her eyes blazing. "How dare you!" she shouted, her voice full of fire. "My daughter is innocent. She's only 9 years old, for God's sake. You have no right to treat her like this." But Jerry stood his ground, his face unyielding. "I was just doing my job, ma'am," he replied coolly. "I saw a suspicious situation and acted accordingly." "Suspicious?" Caroline spat the word out like it tasted bitter on her tongue. "She's a child eating a snack while waiting for her mother. There's nothing suspicious about that." The crowd around them grew larger, the whispers turning into murmurs of disbelief. More phones were raised, recording every second of the confrontation. "Is this for real?" a woman asked from the sidelines. "A little girl? Over a pack of crackers?" Caroline's hands shook as she reached for the door handle of the patrol car. "Take these handcuffs off my daughter right now," she demanded, her voice trembling with fury. "This is absolutely unacceptable." Jerry hesitated, his eyes flicking between Caroline and the onlookers, now murmuring louder with every passing second. His confidence wavered slightly, but he quickly pushed it aside. "Ma'am, I have procedures to follow," he said, his tone firm but faltering just slightly under the weight of the crowd's growing disapproval. "Your procedures?" Caroline's voice dripped with disbelief. "Your procedures led you to handcuff a 9-year-old without even trying to understand the situation? Is that really how you do your job?" The crowd's murmurs turned into clear voices of dissent. "This is wrong," someone shouted. "You can't just arrest a kid like that," another called out. Jerry shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of the eyes on him, judging him, questioning his actions. His hands, once steady and sure, now felt clammy against his sides. Caroline stepped closer to him, her eyes locking onto his with a fiery intensity. "You are supposed to protect and serve, not bully and intimidate," she said, her voice low but dangerous. "I'm filing a formal complaint against you, officer. This kind of behavior is not going to go unnoticed." The crowd murmured in agreement. "Yeah, he should be ashamed of himself," someone shouted from the back. More phones went up, recording every second of the exchange. Jerry's face flushed with frustration, but he stood his ground. "You have the right to file a complaint, ma'am," he said stiffly, "but I stand by my actions." "Oh, you can bet I'll be filing that complaint," Caroline growled. "And I won't stop there. I'll make sure everyone knows how you treat innocent children in this community." She turned to the crowd. "Did anyone get this on video? I'm going to need evidence of this officer's misconduct." Several people raised their phones, nodding in agreement. "I got it all," one woman called out, waving her phone in the air. Jerry's eyes widened as the full weight of the situation began to sink in. The crowd was against him. The phones were capturing every second of his actions, and Caroline was determined to make sure this incident didn't get swept under the rug. Caroline turned back to Jerry, her eyes narrowing. "Now, are you going to take these handcuffs off my daughter, or do I need to call your supervisor?" For the first time, Jerry hesitated, realizing just how badly the situation had spiraled out of his control. Jerry stormed into the police station, his jaw clenched and his heart racing. His mind was swirling with the voices of the crowd, the phone cameras, and Caroline's furious words. "This is out of control," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the weight of what had just happened. He marched straight to his desk, ignoring the curious glances of his colleagues as he plopped down into his chair with a heavy sigh. The familiar hum of the station around him felt different today, colder, more distant. He grabbed a stack of paperwork, hoping to lose himself in the mundane tasks of the job. But before he could pick up his pen, a voice called out from across the room. "Officer Jerry, the chief wants to see you now." Jerry's heart sank. He wasn't surprised, but the dread that washed over him was inescapable. His hands felt sweaty as he stood up, straightened his uniform, and made his way to the chief's office. As he entered, he immediately noticed the stern expression on the chief's face. The usual friendly atmosphere in the office had been replaced by something far more serious. The chief gestured for Jerry to sit down, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Jerry, we've got a problem," the chief said gravely, leaning forward with his hands clasped on the desk. His tone was firm, leaving no room for pleasantries. Jerry's stomach churned. He could already feel where this conversation was headed. "Chief, I was just..." The chief held up his hand, cutting Jerry off. "A formal complaint has been filed against you for racial profiling. It's serious, Jerry. Very serious." Jerry's mouth fell open in shock. "Racial profiling? But His words caught in his throat. He hadn't thought of it like that, but now, hearing it out loud, it hit him differently. The chief's expression didn't soften. The mother of the girl you arrested today has filed a complaint, and we've already received multiple calls from witnesses at the scene. Videos have surfaced online. It's spreading fast." Jerry's face grew hot, the weight of the situation sinking deeper into his chest. He hadn't considered that this would blow up so quickly or at all. "Chief, I was just following protocol. I saw suspicious activity, and I acted." The chief shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Jerry, you arrested a 9-year-old girl without proper cause. And to make matters worse, you did it in front of witnesses, some of whom recorded the entire thing. This doesn't look good, not for you and not for this department." Jerry opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew the chief was right. He had acted on instinct, on suspicion. But had he really seen suspicious activity, or had he jumped to conclusions based on his own biases? "You're under investigation, effective immediately," the chief said, his voice cold. "You're suspended from duty until further notice." The words hit Jerry like a physical blow. Suspended? The station that had once felt like home now seemed hostile, unfamiliar. He was being pushed out, punished for what he had convinced himself was simply doing his job. I was just trying to keep the community safe," Jerry muttered, but the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. The chief's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I know you were, Jerry, but the way you went about it was wrong. You're going to have to face the consequences for your actions." Jerry nodded slowly, his head swimming with thoughts. He stood up from the chair, feeling unsteady on his feet. "I understand, Chief," he said quietly. "I'll cooperate with the investigation." As he left the chief's office, Jerry felt like he was walking in a daze. The fluorescent lights of the station seemed too bright, the chatter of his colleagues too loud. He stumbled back to his desk, collapsing into his chair. His mind replayed the events of the day over and over again. The moment he spotted Natalie outside the grocery store, the suspicion that had gripped him, the decision to arrest her. "How did this happen?" he whispered to himself, staring blankly at the stack of papers on his desk. For the first time in his career, Jerry found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about being a good cop. In the days that followed, Jerry's world seemed to crumble around him. The investigation into the incident at the grocery store moved forward relentlessly, leaving Jerry suspended from duty and stripped of his badge. He had never felt so alone. The station that had once been his second home now felt cold and unwelcoming. When Jerry stopped by to pick up a few personal items from his locker, he noticed how his colleagues averted their eyes. Some who used to chat with him during breaks suddenly found urgent tasks to attend to whenever he was around. Officer Martinez, who Jerry had once considered a friend, barely managed a nod before hurrying away. "Hey, Martinez," Jerry called out, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "Want to grab a coffee later?" Martinez paused, looking uncomfortable. "Sorry, Jerry," he mumbled. "I've got stuff to do. Maybe another time." Jerry watched his colleague retreat down the hallway, the weight of his isolation settling heavily on his shoulders. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the rules, who kept the community safe. How had he ended up here? At home, Jerry paced his living room, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. Natalie's tear-streaked face flashed before him, her big brown eyes wide with fear. But each time the image came to him, he pushed it away, clinging to the belief that he had done the right thing. "I saw suspicious activity," he muttered to himself, his voice echoing off the empty walls. Any good cop would have done the same thing. It had nothing to do with... He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. The thought that his actions might have been racially motivated was too much to bear. It went against everything he believed he stood for. But as the days passed, that small voice of doubt in his mind grew louder. Was he really just doing his job? Or had he jumped to conclusions based on... What? Jerry sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at the morning newspaper. The headline glared back at him, almost mocking him with its bold black letters. "Local officer under investigation for racial profiling." He pushed the paper away, his stomach churning with unease. The words felt surreal, as if they were about someone else. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who followed the rules, who did what was right. How had things spiraled so far out of control? "This is ridiculous," Jerry muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I was just doing my job." But deep down, a small voice nagged at him, persistent and unavoidable. Was he really just doing his job? Or had he jumped to conclusions based on assumptions he had never truly examined? The doubt crept in, slowly at first, but then it grew louder and louder until it was all he could hear. He had been so sure, so confident in his decision to arrest Natalie. But now he wasn't so certain. The next few days passed in a blur. Jerry stayed home, avoiding the outside world, the phone calls, the media attention. His suspension left him with too much time to think, too much time to replay the incident in his mind. Over and over he saw Natalie's face, her wide, tear-filled eyes, her trembling voice as she tried to explain herself. "I didn't do anything wrong." The words echoed in his head, and for the first time Jerry allowed himself to truly hear them. He had been so caught up in his own assumptions, so focused on enforcing the rules, that he hadn't stopped to listen. He hadn't even considered the possibility that Natalie was telling the truth, and now here he was, his career on the line, his reputation in ruins, and his conscience weighing heavily on him. One afternoon, Jerry decided to return to the station to pick up some personal items. He hadn't been back since the day of his suspension, and the thought of walking through those doors filled him with dread. But he had to face it. He had to face what he had done. As he entered the station, the familiar sights and sounds felt foreign to him. Officers moved about, talking, working, but no one acknowledged him. The camaraderie he had once felt was gone, replaced by cold silence and sidelong glances. Jerry made his way to his locker, gathering his things quickly, wanting to leave as soon as possible. But as he turned to go, he noticed Officer Martinez walking by. "Hey, Martinez," Jerry called out, forcing a smile. "Want to grab a coffee later?" Martinez hesitated, looking uncomfortable. He avoided Jerry's eyes, fidgeting with the files in his hands. "Sorry, Jerry," he said quietly. "I'm busy. Maybe another time." Jerry's heart sank. He watched as Martinez hurried away, and the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was alone in this. His colleagues, people he had worked alongside for years, were distancing themselves from him. And who could blame them? His name was now associated with one of the worst accusations a police officer could face: racial profiling. As he left the station, Jerry's thoughts spiraled. He had always prided himself on being fair, on upholding the law without prejudice. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong, that he had let his own biases influence his actions. At home, Jerry sat on his couch, staring blankly at the wall. The silence of his apartment was deafening. He felt trapped in his own mind, trapped in the consequences of his actions. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how blind he had been. He had spent his entire career enforcing the rules, but had he ever really stopped to think about the people behind those rules? Had he ever considered the impact his actions might have on the lives of those he policed? The image of Natalie's tear-streaked face haunted him. Her innocence, her fear, it was all too much to bear. "I was wrong," Jerry whispered to the empty room. It was the first time he had admitted it, even to himself. He had been so focused on doing what he thought was right, on upholding the law, that he had forgotten the most important part of his job: to protect and serve all members of the community. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had hurt an innocent child. Jerry buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as the weight of his actions finally caught up to him. He had made a terrible mistake, and now he had to live with the consequences. That night, as Jerry lay in bed, sleep eluded him. His mind wouldn't stop racing, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Natalie's face. He saw the moment he had handcuffed her, the moment she had cried out for her mother. And each time, the guilt grew heavier. He thought back to his own childhood, to the times when his family had struggled to make ends meet. He remembered how his mother had relied on community charities to get by. And suddenly, the memory hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been that child once, innocent, scared, waiting for help. The realization washed over him in waves. He had lost touch with the very people he had sworn to protect. In his quest to enforce the law, he had forgotten what it meant to be human. The next morning, Jerry made a decision. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could try to make things right. He could learn from his mistakes and change. He picked up his phone and called the community center. "I'd like to volunteer," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "If that's okay?" The woman on the other end of the line hesitated for a moment, but then she spoke with warmth. "We could always use an extra set of hands. Come by any time." Jerry hung up the phone, a sense of determination settling over him. This was his chance to make amends, to prove that he could be better, that he could change. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a start. As he got ready to leave, Jerry glanced at the framed photo of himself in his police uniform. Once, it had been a source of pride. Now it was a reminder of how far he had strayed from the values he once held dear. But today was a new day, and Jerry was ready to face it. Jerry walked up the steps of the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. The bright sign above the entrance read, "Caroline's Kitchen, Feeding Hope." He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. This was it, the moment he would begin to atone for his mistakes. He had no idea what to expect or how he would be received, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go on pretending that what he had done was justified. With shaky hands, Jerry pushed open the door and stepped inside. The smell of fresh bread and simmering soup filled the air, making his stomach growl. Volunteers bustled about, carrying trays and chatting cheerfully. For a moment, Jerry felt out of place in his casual clothes, so different from his usual uniform. A friendly-looking woman approached him, her warm smile putting him slightly at ease. "Hi, can I help you?" she asked kindly. Jerry swallowed hard, his throat dry. I'm here to volunteer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If that's okay." The woman's eyes lit up. "Of course. We always need extra hands. I'm Susan. Let me show you around." As Susan led him through the bustling kitchen, Jerry's eyes darted nervously around the room. He half expected to see Caroline or Natalie, dreading what their reaction would be if they spotted him. But so far there was no sign of them. Still, the weight of his guilt pressed heavily on his chest. Susan led him to a long table covered in vegetables, handing him a hairnet and apron. "We're prepping meals for tonight's service. Think you can handle some chopping?" Jerry nodded, grateful for the simple task. He picked up a knife and began slicing carrots, his movements mechanical as his mind raced. What would he say if he ran into Caroline? Would she even let him stay once she recognized him? As he worked, Jerry overheard snippets of conversation from the other volunteers. They talked about the families they were helping, the difference these meals made in people's lives. Each story chipped away at Jerry's sense of pride, leaving behind only the raw, aching guilt of what he had done. "You're doing great," Susan said, startling Jerry out of his thoughts. She handed him a ladle. "Why don't you help serve the soup? It's almost time to open the doors." Jerry's hands trembled as he ladled soup into bowls. He kept his head down, focusing on his task, unsure if he was truly ready to face the people he had wronged. As he worked, he caught sight of Caroline entering the kitchen. His heart skipped a beat, and he nearly spilled the soup he was holding. Caroline's eyes met his for a brief moment before she quickly looked away, her expression a mix of surprise and discomfort. Jerry's cheeks burned with shame, but he forced himself to keep working. He could feel the tension in the air as Caroline moved to the far end of the serving line, clearly trying to avoid him. Days passed, and Jerry continued to show up at the community center. Each time he worked diligently, chopping vegetables, mopping floors, or serving food, trying to keep his head down. Caroline and her husband remained distant, barely acknowledging his presence. The guilt weighed heavily on Jerry, but he was determined to prove that he was truly sorry. One afternoon, as Jerry was stacking cans in the pantry, he overheard Caroline talking to another volunteer. "I just don't know what to make of him being here," Caroline said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "After what he did to Natalie." "Maybe he's trying to make amends," the other volunteer suggested. Jerry's heart raced. He wanted to explain, to apologize, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, he focused on his task, carefully arranging the cans with trembling hands. As the weeks went by, Jerry noticed small changes. Caroline no longer went out of her way to avoid him. Sometimes he caught her watching him with a thoughtful expression. Her husband, who had been even more distant, even nodded at Jerry one day as they passed each other in the hallway. One day, as Jerry was struggling to carry a heavy box of donations, Caroline's husband approached him. "Need a hand with that?" he asked, his voice neutral, but not unkind. Jerry nodded gratefully. "Thank you, sir." Together, they carried the box to the storage room. As they set it down, Caroline's husband turned to Jerry, his expression serious but not hostile. "You've been here every day for weeks now," he said, studying Jerry's face. "Why?" Jerry took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to explain, to apologize. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I made a terrible mistake," Jerry began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hurt your family, and I can never undo that. But I want to try to make things right, even if it's just in some small way." Caroline's husband was quiet for a moment, his gaze searching Jerry's face for any sign of insincerity. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I see," he said softly. "Well, we could use help sorting these donations." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As they worked side by side, Jerry felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was on the path to making things right. As the evening drew to a close, Jerry found himself face to face with Caroline and her husband in the empty dining area of the community center. The air was thick with tension, but also a sense of inevitability. Jerry knew this conversation was coming, and he was ready to face the consequences of his actions, ready to own up to his mistakes. "Officer Jerry," Caroline began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "We need to talk." Jerry's heart raced, but he nodded, his voice soft. "Of course." Caroline's husband spoke next, his eyes fixed on Jerry. "We've seen you here every day, working hard, but we need to understand. Why did you target our daughter that day?" Jerry felt a lump form in his throat. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered the courage to speak. I made a terrible mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I saw Natalie alone outside the store, I jumped to conclusions. I assumed the worst, without even trying to understand the situation." Tears welled up in Jerry's eyes as he continued. "I let my biases cloud my judgment. I saw a child of color and I immediately thought she must be up to no good. I was so focused on enforcing the rules that I forgot to be human." Caroline's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she listened, her husband placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Jerry's voice cracked as he went on. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong. I've spent every day since then realizing how much harm I caused, not just to Natalie, but to your whole family. I let my prejudices guide my actions, and I failed in my duty to protect and serve." He looked directly at Caroline and her husband, his face etched with remorse. "I am truly, deeply sorry for the pain I caused your family. Natalie didn't deserve that treatment. No child does." Jerry's voice trembled with emotion as he finished. "I know my words can't undo what happened, but I want you both to know that I'm committed to changing, to being better." Caroline and her husband stood in silence for a moment, absorbing Jerry's words. The sincerity in his voice and the tears in his eyes spoke volumes. Caroline took a deep breath, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you for your honesty, Officer Jerry," she said, her voice gentle but still guarded. "It means a lot to hear you acknowledge your mistake." Her husband nodded in agreement. "We've seen how hard you've been working here at the charity. It's clear you're trying to make amends." Jerry wiped his eyes, relief washing over him. He hadn't expected forgiveness, but their willingness to listen meant more than he could express. Caroline continued, "What happened to Natalie? It's not something we can forget easily. But we can see that you're genuinely sorry and want to change." Her husband added, Change takes time and effort. We appreciate that you're putting in both. Jerry nodded earnestly. I understand. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to doing better. Caroline and her husband exchanged a look, seeming to have a silent conversation. After a moment, Caroline turned back to Jerry. We'd like you to continue volunteering here, she said. If you're serious about making things right, this is a good place to start. Jerry's eyes widened in surprise. Really, you'd let me stay? Caroline's husband nodded. Actions speak louder than words, Officer Jerry. We're giving you a chance to show us, and the community, that you mean what you say. Jerry felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise I won't let you down. Caroline managed a small smile. We hope not. This charity means a lot to us, and to the community. Your help is appreciated, and it's a step towards healing. As they prepared to leave, Caroline added, and Officer Jerry, maybe one day, when Natalie feels ready, you can apologize to her too. But that's her choice, and we won't rush her. Jerry nodded solemnly. Of course, I understand completely. Thank you for this opportunity. Jerry continued to volunteer at the charity, showing up every week without fail. At first, the atmosphere was tense. Wary glances and hushed whispers followed him wherever he went. People weren't sure if they could trust him yet, but as the days turned into weeks, something began to change. One afternoon, Jerry was sorting through donated clothes when an elderly woman approached him. Her eyes were kind, but her face showed the wear of a hard life. You're that officer, aren't you? She asked softly. Jerry nodded, his cheeks flushing with shame. Yes, ma'am, I am. To his surprise, the woman patted his arm gently. It takes courage to face your mistakes, young man. I've seen you working hard here. Keep it up. Her words touched Jerry deeply. He realized that the community he had once viewed with suspicion was full of compassionate, resilient people, and he was now a part of that community, working to rebuild the trust he had once shattered. As time went on, Jerry found himself chatting with the families who came for meals. He listened to their stories, tales of job loss, medical bills, and unexpected hardships. Each conversation chipped away at his old preconceptions, replacing them with a deeper understanding of the struggles people faced. One day, a young boy came in with his mother. The child's shoes were worn thin, and Jerry couldn't help but remember his own childhood struggles. Without hesitation, he found a pair of sneakers in the donation pile that would fit the boy. Here you go, buddy, Jerry said, handing them over with a smile. The boy's face lit up, and his mother's eyes filled with grateful tears. Caroline witnessed the interaction from across the room. She approached Jerry afterward, a thoughtful look on her face. You're really changing, aren't you? She asked. Jerry nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. I'm trying. Being here. It's opened my eyes to so much. Caroline smiled softly. I can see that. You know, when you first started coming here, I wasn't sure if you were serious about making amends. But now, I think you really are. Her words meant more to Jerry than she could ever know. He was beginning to see the world, and his role in it, in a whole new light. The badge he once wore as a symbol of authority now felt like a responsibility to protect and serve in a much deeper, more meaningful way. The following week, Jerry stood on the porch of Natalie and Caroline's home, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the house, and Jerry felt his palms grow sweaty as he waited. Caroline opened the door, her expression guarded but not unkind. Officer Jerry, she said softly. Please, come in. Jerry stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. The living room was cozy and warm, filled with family photos and colorful artwork. Natalie sat on the couch, her eyes wide as she looked at Jerry. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Jerry said, his voice thick with emotion. He sat down in an armchair across from Natalie and Caroline, who had taken a seat next to her daughter. Jerry cleared his throat and looked directly at Natalie. Natalie, I want to apologize to you for what happened that day at the grocery store. I made a terrible mistake and I hurt you. I'm so sorry for scaring you and for not listening to you when you tried to explain." Natalie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she nodded silently. Jerry then turned to Caroline. "And to you, Caroline, I want to apologize for the pain and distress I caused your family. My actions were wrong, and I deeply regret them. I've learned so much since then about my own biases and the importance of truly serving and protecting our community." Caroline's expression softened as she listened to Jerry's heartfelt words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes and hear the tremor in his voice. "I know I can't undo what happened," Jerry continued, his voice shaking slightly. "But I want you both to know that I'm committed to doing better. I'm working hard to change, to be the kind of officer this community deserves." Caroline reached out and placed her hand on Jerry's arm. "Thank you, Jerry," she said softly. "Your apology means a lot to us. We can see how hard you've been working at the charity, and we appreciate your efforts to make things right." Natalie, who had been quiet until now, spoke up in a small voice. "Do you really mean it? That you're sorry?" Jerry nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I do, Natalie. I'm so sorry." And then, to Jerry's surprise, Natalie stood up and gave him a quick hug. "I forgive you," she whispered. Jerry felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he gently returned the hug. When Natalie stepped back, he saw Caroline wiping away a tear. "We accept your apology, Jerry," Caroline said, "and we appreciate you coming here to talk to us. It's a big step towards rebuilding trust." As word of Jerry's volunteer work spread through the police station, his colleagues began to take notice. At first, many were skeptical, unsure if Jerry's change of heart was genuine or just a ploy to save his career. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in their once rigid co-worker. Officer Mina Thompson, who had always found Jerry's by-the-book approach frustrating, was one of the first to recognize the change. She watched as Jerry arrived at the station one morning, a warm smile on his face as he greeted the custodian by name. "Morning, Jerry," Mina said, curiosity getting the better of her. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time at that local charity. How's that going?" Jerry's eyes lit up. "It's been eye-opening, Mina. I never realized how much impact a simple act of kindness could have on our community." As Jerry shared stories about the families he'd met and the connections he'd made, Mina found herself drawn in. She had never seen this side of Jerry before, compassionate, humble, and genuinely invested in the well-being of others. Word of Jerry's transformation spread quickly through the department. Some officers, like Detective Mike Roberts, remained skeptical. "People don't change that easily," Mike grumbled during a staff meeting. "He's just trying to save face." But others were intrigued. Officer Tom Chen, a rookie who had always felt uncomfortable with the department's aggressive tactics, approached Jerry one afternoon. "Hey, Jerry," Tom said hesitantly. "I was wondering if you could tell me more about that sensitivity training you went through. It sounds interesting." Jerry smiled warmly. "Of course, Tom. I'd be happy to share what I've learned. It's changed the way I see our role in the community." As Jerry spoke about implicit bias and the importance of building trust, a small group of officers gathered around listening intently. Even Mike, despite his initial skepticism, found himself drawn into the conversation. By the end of the week, Jerry's influence had begun to ripple through the department. Officers were discussing community outreach initiatives during their breaks, and some had even started volunteering at local events. The once rigid and rule-focused culture of the department was beginning to soften, replaced by a more empathetic approach to policing. A second chance on the job. Jerry's heart raced as he walked into the police station. It had been weeks since he'd last worn his uniform, and the weight of uncertainty hung heavy on his shoulders. As he approached the chief's office, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever news awaited him. "Come in, Jerry," the chief called out, his voice neutral. Jerry stepped inside, his posture straight but his eyes betraying a mix of hope and apprehension. "You wanted to see me, sir?" The chief nodded, gesturing for Jerry to take a seat. "I've been reviewing your case, Jerry. The investigation into the incident with young Natalie has concluded." Jerry's throat tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for the verdict. "I have to say, I've been impressed by your actions over the past few weeks," the chief continued. Your volunteer work at the charity, your commitment to making amends, it shows a level of growth I wasn't sure you were capable of." A glimmer of hope flickered in Jerry's chest, but he dared not let it show. "After careful consideration, I've decided to reinstate you to active duty," the chief announced. Relief washed over Jerry, but before he could respond, the captain held up a hand. "However, there are conditions," he said firmly. "Your reinstatement comes with the requirement for ongoing community involvement. We want to ensure that this growth continues." Jerry nodded eagerly. "Of course, sir, I'm more than willing to continue my work with the charity." "And it's more than that, Jerry," the chief interrupted. "We're implementing a new community outreach program, and I want you to be a part of it. You'll be required to attend monthly sensitivity training sessions and participate in community events. Additionally, you'll be partnered with Officer Thompson to lead youth engagement initiatives." Jerry felt a mix of excitement and nervousness at the prospect. It was more than he had expected, but he knew it was an opportunity to continue making a difference. "I understand, sir," Jerry replied, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let you down." The chief's stern expression softened slightly. "I believe you, Jerry. This is your chance to be the kind of officer our community needs. Don't waste it." As Jerry left the office, his reinstated badge felt both familiar and new in his hand. He knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his career, one focused on building bridges and fostering understanding in the community he had sworn to protect and serve, earning back trust. As the weeks passed, Jerry continued his work with the charity and his community outreach efforts. He often saw Natalie there, but she would always shy away, hiding behind her mother or busying herself with tasks far from where he was working. Jerry understood her hesitation and respected her space, focusing instead on proving himself through his actions. One sunny afternoon, as Jerry was helping to sort through donated clothes, he noticed Natalie struggling with a heavy box of canned goods. Without thinking, he rushed over to help her. "Here, let me give you a hand with that," Jerry said softly, careful not to startle her. Natalie looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, she seemed unsure, but then she nodded slightly. Together, they carried the box to its destination. As they worked side by side, Jerry noticed Natalie sneaking glances at him. He offered her a gentle smile, and to his amazement, she returned it with a small one of her own. From that day on, Natalie's wariness began to fade. She no longer avoided Jerry at the charity events, and sometimes she even sought him out for help with tasks. Jerry always made sure to be patient and kind, showing her that he was there to support her. As time went on, Natalie's trust in Jerry grew. She started to ask him questions about his job and his life, her natural curiosity overcoming her initial fear. Jerry answered honestly, often sharing stories that made her giggle or gasp in wonder. One day, as they were planting flowers in the community garden, Natalie turned to Jerry with a serious look on her face. "Officer Jerry," she said, her voice small but steady, "I used to be scared of you, but now I think you're nice." Jerry felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Natalie," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot to me. I'm sorry I scared you before, and I promise to always be someone you can trust." Natalie nodded, a bright smile spreading across her face. From that moment on, their bond deepened. Jerry became a mentor figure to Natalie, offering guidance and support whenever she needed it. He helped her with homework, taught her about safety, and even showed her how to ride a bike. As their relationship grew, Jerry realized that Natalie had not only forgiven him, but had also taught him invaluable lessons about innocence, trust, and the power of second chances. Her openness and willingness to see the good in him inspired Jerry to continue his journey of growth and community service.